flowers gone. Long time passing.
Oh, the country was young, with God on its side.
And he knows he shouldn't kill, and he knows he always will.
Rehearsals for Retirement. Rehearsals for Retirement on all the levels from
So welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time here. Vinyl Monday is the who, what, when, where, why, and how do I feel about classic albums in my collection. If TV show length or just long episodes aren't your thing, don't worry. I also do Vinyl Monday in 60 seconds here on my channel, over on my Instagram, as well as TikTok. Batten down the hatches, people. This is a long episode. There is a lot of unavoidable historical and political context that made this week's album. This will be a heavy week. It's dark. It's not an easy listen. But I'm covering as much as I possibly can because I want to do right by this artist and the messages in his work. I don't want to bungle this. I hope you viewers will see the value in moving through all this context. It illuminates this album's historical significance, and I feel strongly about this album's relevance today. This week's album is Phil Ochs, Rehearsals for Retirement. If you so choose, you can always read the written versions of my reviews on my website. Alright, we've got no time to waste this week, so let's take the plastic off. My copy is an original on the gold A&M labels. I found this at, where else? Turn It Up Records in Northampton, Massachusetts. It's where I found last week's record too, and like 25 other Vinyl Monday albums at this point. Finding this was the deciding factor on making this episode. Now let's talk about this cover art. The Rehearsals for Retirement art was photographed by Tom Wilkes. Phil himself commissioned this headstone. Who took the photo of Phil? That much isn't listed, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was Phil's brother / manager, Michael Ochs. Phil Ochs, American. Born El Paso, Texas, 1940. Died Chicago, Illinois, 1968. This gunslinging guy against the American flag is dead and gone. And what happened in Chicago killed him. As we'll hear through the next couple chapters of this video, what happened in Chicago made this album. On the back cover, we have this poem by Phil, From Whence the Title Came. My responsibilities are done, let them come, and I realize these last days, these trials and tragedies were, after all, only our rehearsals for retirement. On Rehearsals for Retirement, we have, of course, Phil Ochs on lead vocals, guitar, and serving as principal songwriter. He is accompanied by Bob Rafkin on guitar and bass, Lincoln Mayorga on piano and accordion, and an anonymous drummer. It seems no one bothered to write down who he was. Rehearsals for Retirement was produced by Larry Marks, with arrangements by Ian Freeburn Smith. Roll transition. It wouldn't be a Vinyl Monday if I didn't do the drop, jacket, roll transition thing. You know, definitely a tonal change to this episode. I realized that we gotta keep some sense of familiarity. Okay, to understand the circumstances that bore Rehearsals for Retirement, we have to go back a few years before it. This chapter will be heavy on the history. Rehearsals for Retirement was molded by the times. I'll be interspersing what goes on in Phil's life between significant events in the American political landscape of the mid to late 1960s. American politics and Phil's career were closely connected, to say the absolute least. In early 1965, President Lyndon Johnson started rolling out his Great Society programs, which included Medicaid, expanding food stamps and welfare programs, dispersing federal funds to public schools, and translating advances made by the civil rights movement to law.
It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country.
Johnson's foreign policy, though, was, for lack of a better term, off the fucking rails. He buckled down on what JFK was doing before him, ramping up America's involvement in Vietnam, aka Operation Rolling Thunder. Being a topical singer, Phil Ochs turned his attention from civil rights causes to anti-war causes. Since Phil became friends with Paul Krassner and Jerry Rubin, more on him later, he knew civil rights and the war to be intrinsically linked, which is linked to the class struggle as well. The military doesn't start wars, rich old men do.
It's always the old to lead us to the wars, always the young to fall.
Rich kids could get out of the draft, but poor kids, especially black men, couldn't. I've brought up this statistic a few times in past videos. I will have it on the screen, but until 1967, black men were being disproportionately drafted. In the mid-1960s, the issue of Vietnam split the voting left. Young voters, many draft age in college, saw the US had no business being in Vietnam. The older voters sided with the Democrat-controlled executive and legislative branches who thought,
"We're protecting this country from the dirty old commies."
This age group heard the music Phil was making, the messages he was preaching, and deemed them controversial. Plus, the mainstream didn't always get Phil's sarcasm. Phil saw Vietnam wasn't strictly a left versus right issue. Even politicians who claimed to be on the people's side were complicit. Now, this may seem obvious to us in 2025. It may even seem obvious to those in 1970, but this was a radical idea in the early to mid-1960s. All of the above, like the past 4 minutes of it, fueled two career-defining songs for Phil: Draft Dodger Rag and I Ain't Marchin' Anymore. The former, one of my personal favorites, lampoons the draft and those who try to get out of it. The latter was, I think, the closest to a hit Phil ever had, and it became an anthem for the anti-war movement. I Ain't Marchin' Anymore, Phil got away with. Draft Dodger Rag as well. Love Me, I'm a Liberal, where he turned his pen on the left, only toting the causes that affected them personally.
Love Puerto Ricans and Negroes, as long as they don't move next door. So love me.
That was a little too blunt for the folky scene right now. They were still enamored with Blowin' in the Wind, long after Dylan had moved on from them. The popularity of the topical song, which Phil had built his career on, was waning. Dylan was invited to the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, plugged in his guitar. The rest is rock and roll history. Phil Ochs, just about as folk as you can get, wasn't invited. It really makes you think about the narrative surrounding that festival. Phil was always torn between political commentator and commercial success. Before this, Phil went on this wild goose chase to headline Carnegie Hall, which became a live album which contained these liner notes, which officially elevated him to security matter to the FBI. But like Dylan, Phil has his eye on something bigger than folk, and in 1966 he pieces out from Elektra because they won't fund his next album. These fleshed out arrangements that Phil and his producer, I think he's the same producer on this record. Sorry, I'm just looking at my jackets here. Yes, Larry Marks. It was Larry Marks. Put forth meant hiring more session musicians, and Holtzman and company weren't exactly willing to go out on a limb. They were hesitant to drop that kind of money on such a niche artist. Phil really liked Highway 61 and Pet Sounds, Rubber Soul too. He was a lifelong film buff, he collected film soundtracks, he wanted to break into pop music, but Elektra just didn't think he was the right guy to do it. Paranoid he's getting screwed over, Phil fires his old manager and hires his brother, Michael. This comes as a surprise to everyone, especially Michael. They go out to California in search of a new record label. Michael lands his brother a deal with A&M Records. The deciding factor was the publishing rights. Phil would get to keep it all. This eventually brought Pleasures of the Harbor to fruition. Though it's considered one of his essential works today, his first big reach outside of straight folk, it was universally panned upon release. On March 2nd of 1967, Senator Robert Kennedy addresses the Senate floor proposing an end to the Vietnam War, the war his own brother had a hand in starting. Phil flew to DC, met Bobby, who asked him, a frequent college campus performer, about what the college kids were feeling. When asked to play him a song, Phil boldly chose Crucifixion.
Of the night, truth becomes a tragedy, limping from the light.
The song about JFK's assassination. In hindsight, Phil chose a pretty good time to move to California. As far as the culture goes, anyway. Thanks to backlash to Pat Brown's handling of the Watts riots, the future second worst president of the United States, Ronald Reagan, was just elected governor. It really does all come back to Reagan. That makes the state of California becoming hippie mecca in the late 60s all the more a marvel. Phil, of course, got involved in all the protesting. He lifted Allen Ginsberg's idea that simply saying war is over will end the war and made it into street theater. Phil did it once in LA on June 23rd. It was a disaster. The crowd was beat into dispersing by the police. Phil learned from his mistakes, restaged the War is Over celebration in New York. It went much smoother. But in the words of There But For Fortune, The Life of Phil Ochs author Michael Schumacher, LA, quote, was a learning experience. It taught Phil that the war was far from being over. If anything, the real battles were just beginning. Who took notice? One Abby Hoffman. Ladies and gentlemen, cretins of caves, enter the Yippies. For being a channel so focused on the culture of the late 1960s in America, it is amazing to me that the Yippies have only ever been mentioned tangentially. So, here's a crash course. From Life magazine in October of 1968, so kind of a Yippie post-mortem. Quote, irreverent obscenity and outrageous vulgarity are ancient and splendid weapons for social protest. There is much to ponder in the Yippie, with the four-letter word, of which they used liberally, quote, painted on his forehead, who said, after the napalming of children, nothing is obscene. The Youth International Party was long for the Yippies, not the other way around. Their objective was specifically to show up to the DNC and undermine the electoral process / America as a global superpower through spectacle, mockery, and absurdism. Basically, the Yippies were a bit. They wanted to with people. They were trolls, but trolls with a cause. Quote, instead of sending out boring form letters or making tedious telephone calls, or, to take it a step further, instead of marching with picket signs, activists should use a kind of street theater that didn't directly come out and say, end the war or fight poverty, but instead drew mass media attention through its weirdness. By drawing in the mass media, they'd reach an audience that would have never even considered radical politics or a counterculture way of life. Now we have finally arrived in 1968. The nation is a powder keg in an abandoned warehouse waiting to explode. The divide between young people and their parents is deeper than ever. If you showed up in the wrong neighborhood with long hair, you'd get the shit kicked out of you. And if you were black too, forget about it. It is crazy to think that if you had long hair and a beard and flew an American flag out of the back of your pickup truck, you'd be considered a crazy left-winger. Oh, how the times have changed. Meanwhile, Phil Ochs has been officially rejected from the folky scene. Dylan and the yet-to-be-christened band were invited to play Woody Guthrie's memorial concert at Carnegie Hall in January. Phil was not. On March 16th, as he was in the middle of recording Pleasures of the Harbor's follow-up, Bobby Kennedy announces he's running for president.
I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course, and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, and I feel that I'm obliged to do all that I can.
And on the 31st, President Johnson announces he is no longer seeking re-election. This essentially turned the whole election on its head. But about a week later, on April 4th, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Cities all over America burst into riots. Dr. King's death effectively split the civil rights movement in two. Half stayed the course of nonviolence and respectability politics. The other half sought something more militant. 2 months later, at a rally celebrating his shock primary win, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. This even further disenfranchised black voters. Tape from California comes out in July, critically acclaimed, commercially ignored. And I'm presenting this album right now because it's an artifact of just before the second tonal shift of the 1960s. Many say the 60s were split in half by JFK's assassination. I'd argue the decade was split in three. Tape from California is the 60s before the spring of 1968. Rehearsals for Retirement was the 60s after. This brings us to the 1968 Democratic National Convention. The favorite candidate is dead. Who's gonna take on Nixon and Agnew now? Oh, how about, Hubert Humphrey? Not to use Zoomer lingo in a decidedly un-Zoomer situation, but the Democrats were so cooked. Allen Ginsberg is here in Chicago this week, chanting OM. The National Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam, or the MOB for short, an anti-war activist group much more geared towards the straight people, they were here as well. The Black Panthers are here. The motherfuckers are here. The Students for a Democratic Society are here. And as planned, the Yippies are here, trolling the hell out of the DNC like they were expressly created to do. Like the whole war is over thing, they also acted in the tradition of street theater a la the Diggers. See, buying a pig, bringing it into the city, and nominating it. Phil was kind of a yippie, but also kinda not. He did organize the War is Over demonstration with Paul Krasner, Jerry Rubin, and Abby Hoffman, but he also went to Chicago as a guest of Eugene McCarthy's presidential campaign. Though Phil himself helped orchestrate the piggy stunt, he said the Yippies, I'm paraphrasing here, were trying to take down a tractor with yo-yos. There was a lot going on in Chicago to begin with when the Yippies showed up. The electrical workers were on strike. The black drivers of the Chicago Transit Authority were on strike as well. The Yippies came in and threatened to take over the city if they had to. They were bluffing, but the city didn't know that. Fellow musician Dave Van Ronk warned Phil not to go to Chicago. It was a setup. But they persisted with this thing called the Festival of Life to oppose what they called the Convention of Death. The city refused permits for a soundstage. That did not stop the Yippies. It did stop some of the San Francisco bands who'd promised to show up, then didn't. Who did have the balls to show? Or perhaps the sheer unchecked hubris of 5 20-something-year-old men from Detroit? Our boys! The MC5 set up on a truck bed, ran all their gear through one extension cord hooked up to a hot dog stand, got zooted beyond this mortal plane on very, very strong hash cookies, and harmonized with the police choppers. Wait. Police choppers? So this is about where the 68 DNC turns from silly yippie protest into one of the most infamous and horrifying abuses of state power in modern American history. After Martin Luther King's assassination and the subsequent riots, the mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, issued a, quote, shoot to kill order to 12,000 police officers on duty. Any potential arsonist or agitator was to be taken out. This was kept intentionally vague and meant to extend through the DNC. There was a citywide curfew as well. He wanted to keep the people safe, even if it meant sacrificing others' safety to do so, including his own officers. We will get to that later. On top of that, there were a combined 11,500 National Guardsmen and Army troops on standby. Daley knew things would be running hot, especially if the crowd was filled with undercover agents. As many as 1 in 6 protesters were feds in disguise, intentionally agitating the crowd. Soon, the park was surrounded. The Festival of Life turned into a riot, and it just sparked this horrible domino effect across the next few days. Protests at Grant Park, Lincoln Park, the Loop, and in the streets were all targeted. Mayor Daley sent out officers, vans, police dogs, riot gear, a military-grade gassing mechanism hooked up to a garbage truck. There was so much tear gas in the air. It was floating into people's homes and cars. With every night, the violence intensified, fueled in part by officers on duty for 12, 14, 16 hours at a time. The night of August 28th on Michigan Avenue was the worst. That's where the most infamous accounts of the rioting come from, including police protecting a soldier as he beat up the medic, then attacking the press photographing it. Amidst thousands and thousands of casualties, only one person was killed in the protests, a 17-year-old boy who, when stopped for curfew violation, pulled a gun on the officers. If I include many more details from this week, the night of the 28th especially, this video will almost certainly be taken down. If you want a play-by-play of who all was in Chicago, their motivations, and how things got as bad as they did, David Farber's Chicago 68 is in my further reading section this week. From MC5 drummer Dennis Thompson in Please Kill Me, one of the books I always have behind me. Quote, "I knew the revolution was over in that moment. I looked over my shoulder and no one else was there. We were the ones who were gonna get hanged." One can imagine this is exactly how Phil Ochs felt. He didn't play the Festival of Life. He played one of the other few demonstrations that the Yippies actually got permits for. But he saw the Festival of Life go down. You can see him in the FBI surveillance footage. He saw people get tear gassed, thrown in vans, shot at on the sidewalk, officers playing whack-a-mole with people's skulls. And the Democratic nominee, Hubert Humphrey, sided with the mayor, which only made him less popular to young voters. If you ask me, that was when he handed the 1968 election to Nixon. About Chicago and its repercussions, Yippie co-founder Jerry Rubin said in his book, quote, "Most people are eager to say the pigs flipped out or that they finally showed their true colors. I disagree. I believe what happened in Chicago is a direct result of conspiracies hatched by the Republican Party and those who supported Nixon for president, working hand in hand with the racist right-wing John Birchers, a far-right-wing lobbyist, the John Birch Society, quote, who control the Chicago Police Department just as they control the police departments in many important cities throughout the country. The Republicans knew they had to move in a decisive manner or risk the Democrats winning. So someone dreamed up the greedy idea of shocking the American people into fear and hysteria. The situation was made to order for a pig setup, and it worked. And no one cared. Quote, among those who did, many felt the cops hadn't gone far enough. While the Yippies and other radicals had been creating and recreating their own counterculture, they had alienated the American working class along with Middle America. Nixon, who would ride to victory above the shattered remains of a splintered Democratic Party, called these frightened Americans the silent majority. A lot of Rehearsals for Retirement criticizes this silent majority. The DNC and the outcome of the 1968 presidential election fundamentally altered Phil. His strong sense of justice was shaken. He fell into a deep depression. His beautiful faith in the power of music to make real change was snuffed out, replaced with resentment, cynicism, and rage. And from the material he was writing at this time, it seems Phil came to the agreement that it was all a setup, too. Over a period of 2 weeks, Phil wrote most of Rehearsals for Retirement. The Dollhouse was back from the Tape from California days. He wrote this album about, quote, new paranoia, police brutality, the escape into drugs, Chicago itself, people coming to the West, thoughts of suicide, thoughts of revolution, and then finally pulling back and saying all this has been our rehearsals for retirement. The track listing of Rehearsals for Retirement goes as follows. Opening up side 1, we have Pretty Smart on My Part, followed by The Dollhouse. Then, I Kill, Therefore I Am. Next, William Butler Yeats visits Lincoln Park and escapes unscathed with hidden track, Where Were You in Chicago? And side 1 closes with My Life. Opening up side 2, we have The Scorpion Departs But Never Returns, followed by The World Began in Eden and Ended in Los Angeles. Then, Doesn't Lenny Live Here Anymore? Next, Another Age, and the album closes with the title track, Rehearsals for Retirement. Rehearsals for Retirement was released in May of 1969. Phil's gig at Carnegie Hall that April was received surprisingly well, considering he hadn't been on the East Coast in ages at this point. He included pretty much all of Rehearsals for Retirement in that set, plus the standards, I Ain't Marching Anymore and all. Very soon after this gig, Phil got a phone call. He was summoned as a witness for the defense in the trial of the Chicago 8. Nowadays, we understand this trial as an attempt to undermine anti-war movements, Black Power, and the New Left by jailing its significant figures. It worked with John Sinclair out in Detroit. He was busted for possession, sentenced to 10 years, and the White Panthers crumbled in his absence.
While John Sinclair rots in prison.
Back in Chicago, when Black Panther Bobby Seale was bound and gagged in court, the judge was forced to declare a mistrial, so the Chicago 8 became the Chicago 7. Phil was called as a witness for the defense to assert Chicago was planned as a music festival, not a demonstration. Parts of the transcript were published in Mark Elliott's Death of a Rebel. Yes, he was asked about the pig. Did you yourself have any role in that? Buying the pig. Yes, I helped select the pig and I paid for him. Where did you find the pig? I don't remember the exact place. Was it a pig or a piglet? Objection! I sustain the objection. Did you buy the pig yourself or with other people? I bought the pig with Jerry Rubin. And did anything happen in connection with that pig subsequently at a time when Jerry Rubin was present? I object to the form of question, Your Honor. It is leading and suggestive. I sustain the objection. Would you state what, if anything, happened to the pig? The pig was arrested with 7 people. This guitar was in tune when I started filming. We are currently having our first random 90-degree day of the season. I need to get out of this leather jacket. But before I go, Phil tried to sing I Ain't Marching Anymore on the stand. The judge said no, so he just recited the lyrics. He did sing it on the courthouse steps after his testimony, though. If I had a nickel for every time there were a piggy-related mishap in relation to a Vinyl Monday album, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right? Goofy as his testimony proved to be, the failure of Rehearsals for Retirement haunted Phil. It wasn't so much a failure as it was critically and commercially ignored despite A&M's promotional efforts. They pulled it from retail after a month and canceled the rest of this tour when people wouldn't stop shouting out requests for other songs as Phil was playing Rehearsals for Retirement cuts. After this album, he pivoted away from protest songs and folk entirely. As a wise man once sang, God help the troubadour who tried to be a star. He saw Elvis in Vegas, commissioned a gold lame nudie suit, and released a country rock album. As he declared with this album art, Phil Ochs, the folk singer, was dead. What did Phil's stylistic shift link back to? Say it with me, folks, the Back to Basics movement. It was his return to comfort. Country, and good old-fashioned rock and roll. We can kind of see this in his personal style before this. By 1968, he was wearing a white shirt and his leather jacket. That's sort of the look I've referenced today. If you're new here, I always do little stylistic nods to the guys I cover just because it's another layer of homage to them. And he returned to his earliest influences, who dressed like that. Hank Williams, Lefty Frizzell, Carl Perkins, Elvis Presley. That move was intrinsically linked to American politics as well. After the collective generational trauma of 1968 through 1969, the culture turned back the clock. Psychedelic day-glow colors turned to muted browns. Brocade jackets were traded in for Daniel Boone buckskins. Country went from redneck music to pop. Dylan had finally returned the month before with his country turn Nashville Skyline. Sly and the Family Stone has America getting funky, and Fifth Dimension is asserting this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. A young female singer-songwriter named Joni Mitchell is on the rise. The Who finally released Tommy after like a year of hype. The hype for this new Eric Clapton supergroup has been insane all year. Also on the supergroup front, Crosby, Stills, and Nash are about to debut and will pretty immediately be heralded as the American Beatles. There just wasn't the space for an old-school topical song singer, and a whole album about an event everybody would just like to forget. I am fascinated by Phil Ochs. A whole career of contradictions, almosts, not quites, and what ifs. He asserted he wrote purely for personal expression, but his career was so intrinsically linked to the New Left that when the movement fell apart after the DNC, he lost touch with the muse. His politics had him blacklisted and banned for his whole career, but he refused to compromise to be more palatable for mainstream audiences. At the same time, he hired Albert Grossman, Derek Taylor, spent 40 grand recording Pleasures of the Harbor. He very nearly had a deal with Bob Dylan's record label, Columbia, but it fell through after they lowballed him. Phil always sought Dylan's approval, but got picked on like a little brother. See Dylan throwing Phil out of his limo for daring to criticize a song he wrote. God, he was a menace in the mid-60s. Unfortunately, it wasn't Phil that got me curious about Phil, it was Bob. Specifically, Bob's reaction to hearing of Phil's passing, as recounted by Bob Spitz. It seems Phil's absence defines him in a way. It's odd, because at his best times, he was so present. That's why I'm captivated by him. When I read he was tapped for a potential film role, I thought, oh yeah, a singer who could act makes perfect sense for him. He had this inherent charisma, even on Rehearsals for Retirement, when he's at his most dejected and bitter, he's still so damn likable. I realize Phil Ochs, this album especially, is an objectively wild place to introduce capital F folk to Vinyl Monday. My Phil Ochs friend Mark, when I told him this was in the queue, he sent me this meme. So why the hell did I go with Rehearsals for Retirement and not, say, Pleasures of the Harbor, Tape from California, I Ain't Marching Anymore? Anything but Rehearsals for fucking Retirement. Firstly, the music. Right down to the studs, Rehearsals for Retirement could not have been made in 2025. It'd be a completely different album. It's so rooted in what happened in Chicago. I heard this and went, I can't not write about this. The themes, though. Paranoia and us versus them mentality, normalizing violence. Those are evergreen. I also chose Rehearsals for Retirement for its significance to the year I have covered the most on this channel, 1968. I believe 1968 was the single most important year in modern American history, and there's no better way to understand a place in time than to look at the art it produced. Which leads me to the third reason. Rehearsals for Retirement's connection to our current times. A foreign conflict that I can't call by name right now because if I did, this video would surely get taken down or suppressed, and I'm trying really hard to keep this episode up. Something that the US should not be funding, I hope that's enough of a clue, split the American voting left, and it's part of how we ended up here. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. One of Phil's strengths as an artist was that he was a journalist. He loved talking to people, especially those who disagreed with him. He could poke fun at both sides, but on Rehearsals for Retirement, Phil's sense of humor is gone. He is not playing around. At the very least, Phil the folk singer came to an end. There are still topical singers, as we'll hear, but Rehearsals for Retirement has a bit of an identity crisis. Almost every other track switches back and forth from satire/commentary on the external to his inner thoughts and feelings. Rehearsals for Retirement opens with one of the most out-of-pocket songs of the bunch, Pretty Smart on My Part. It is funny, but in a way that has you going, oh my god, Phil! The narrator of the song is the stereotypical American macho man, ruled by paranoia and violence, imprisoned by his paranoia and all diseases of his innocent inventions. He hates hippies, the Vietnamese who talk Chinese and spread disease, and women. He can run over a hitchhiker and fry them just fine. He supports the American government arranging for the assassination of a foreign president and installing a puppet leader. But when an intruder breaks into his own home, fuck that. He leaves his wife for dead. Sometime later, when I feel a little braver, I'll go hunting with my rifle when the wild geese are flying, and then I'm gonna bag one. I know Greatest Hits is painted as this sudden pivot, but we hear a little country and rock trickling in on Pretty Smart, with an old school country beat and electric guitar. It's a little Buddy Holly, a little Carl Perkins. Phil harmonizes with himself on the choruses. It's gorgeous despite the subject matter. Phil had such a distinct, expressive voice, lifted up by that very upward posture. You know, that folk thing of holding your guitar all the way up here. Next is the dollhouse, with pretty music box-like piano. The ballerina was posed. There's lots of obscure imagery in the lyrics. Pirate Jenny dancing for pennies, Tom Sawyer, a lady from the lake helping him escape, like the lady in the lake in The Legends of Arthur. This all comes into focus on the second to last chorus, where Phil does his very best 1966 Bob Dylan impression.
And the lady from the lake help me.
I still ask myself, why would Phil be spoofing 66 Dylan in 68? Maybe because Phil tried to make his own Blonde on Blonde with Pleasures of the Harbor, maybe as a barb as he remembered how Bob always treated him like the dorky younger brother. Doll's House is Phil's really depressing Desolation Row, a magical, idyllic world fleeing like flowers at his feet. It's full of pirate tricksters, the magnificent battle is fought. Phil even name-drops Cinderella.
And the Cinderella soldier fish was caught. It's Cinderella sweeping up on Desolation Road.
This corrupted wonderland might just be a brothel. Our narrator seems to be a jester in all this, but having looked behind the curtain of this fairy tale land, even he can't play along anymore. My costume dropped to the floor, naked at last, couldn't fight anymore, and the service was rendered. Very clinical wording there. Service was rendered. Sex without passion, or a funeral service. Considering the packaging of the record, I think it's both. A poem fell from the wine, buried in the past, the future was mine, and the present suffered. Longing for the good old days and picturing this utopian future will have what's happening right now under your nose in your blind spot. Kids in Chicago were so set on the future, and people in power were so set on the past, it made the whole thing in Chicago blow. The title of the next track is a morbid twist on Descartes' most enduring statement. I think, therefore I am. Nah, these dumb Americans aren't thinking. I kill, therefore I am. A little closer to a straight rock and roll song of the time, it acts as an ironic counterpoint to the lyrics. Think Pretty Smart's Country Bounce. The narrator of this song is an overzealous, bloodthirsty police officer in the streets of Chicago. Meet the king of cowboys, he rides a pale pony, he fights the bad boys, brings them to their knees. Cops on horses, breaking up the crowds in the parks. He patrols the highway from the air, the guys in the choppers. He keeps the country safe from long hair, or whatever other perceived threat. The black man doesn't know his place, the students don't respect his authority. They call me pig, although I'm underpaid. I'll show those not saying that word that I'm not afraid. I don't know, man. Kinda sounds like you're afraid. Fragile masculinity much? He's got a gun, and he's a hater. He shoots first, he shoots later. This may be a reference to the kid that was killed after he pulled a gun on the cops. I Kill Therefore I Am revisits the ideas presented in Pretty Smart. The macho man exercising his strength on people smaller than him or those who challenge his authority. He feels it's his right to do so. I am the masculine American man. I kill, therefore I am. William Butler Yeats is a morose piano ballad, Morning Lincoln Park. It describes what happened there and in the streets as the people fled. It's arranged like a star-crossed romance, with accordion and violin. Phil paints the scene as fated to go wrong. I was blessed by a blood-red moon. Several ancient cultures saw lunar eclipses, blood moons, as bad omens. It seems Phil now agrees with Jerry Rubin and understands Chicago was a setup. They spread their sheets upon the ground just like a wandering tribe, images of a peaceful protest and travelers. A lot of the people who turned up that week were not from Chicago. It's part of why Bloody Wednesday was such pandemonium. People didn't know where they were going and quite literally did not know what they were walking into. And the wise men in their Robespierre robes. Robespierre was the guy during the French Revolution. He cultivated such an environment of persecution and hysteria that eventually they guillotined him. The ultimate Western example of being taken out by the machine you've built. Phil is saying the powers that be will get taken out this way. The towers trapped and trembling, and the boats were tossed about when the fog rolled in and the gas rolled out, references the tear gas, and likens the new left to a sinking ship, which we'll hear again in a few tracks. Maybe it wasn't 100% accurate to say Phil's sense of humor is gone, because at the end of William Butler Yeats' hidden track, Where Were You in Chicago? That is his sense of humor's dying breath. The punchline? Where were you in Chicago? 'Cause I was in Detroit. This guy wasn't there either. He was watching from the sidelines. What a hypocrite. I haven't heard this on streaming services, just my physical copy. I made sure the disc and my stylus were clean. This could still be a crackle, but I swear to God, I hear tap dancing. My life's arrangement sounds like something a pop singer might do. Strings, flute, light use of brass, and a late 1960s bubblegum pop radio band. A la The Wrecking Crew, and a swing time change in the choruses. The narrator laments the good old white picket fence days when it was easier to be naive to what happened in the world. He once believed in the American dream and fell in line with the straight crowd. My life was once a flag to me, and I waved it and behaved like I was told. But it seems now he's been rudely awakened. I was drawn by a dream, I was loved by a lie. Later, my life is now a myth to me. My life is now a death to me. This is what happens when you center your whole life around whatever you're taught by some great big machine. When that ideal doesn't hold up, when the machine inevitably breaks down, you as a person crumble. My life morphs into a reflection on Phil's own career and life. In the last verse, he pleads, "Take everything I own, take your tap from my phone, and leave my life alone." After he passed, it was revealed the FBI's file on him was several hundred pages long. It wasn't so much a file as it was a fucking novel. Opening up side 2 is The Scorpion Departs But Never Returns, a piano ballad about the sinking of the USS Scorpion in May of '68. Phil wasn't done with the topical song just yet. And this wasn't his first song about an American submarine. He wrote about the Thresher on All the News That's Fit to Sing. Richie Unterberger said The Scorpion Departs, quote, put the apocalyptic lumness that hovered over most of Rehearsals for Retirement in more symbolic terms. Certainly it could just be taken as a tale of a ship lost at sea, but it also reflects directionlessness Ochs saw in both the course of America and within his own life. I think Phil is likening death at sea to being the last man standing after the cause was either sabotaged or abandoned as people fled for safety. Where are my shipmates? Have they sunk beneath the sea? The narrator looks for any signs of life. Not a trace, not a toothbrush, not a cigarette was seen. Instead of a quick implosion like the Scorpions, Phil gives the crew time to vote and officers time to drink to better swallow the inevitability of death. A lot of Rehearsals for Retirement could be described as haunting. This album is heavy and dark like a storm on the horizon. There's a couple lines, though, that stick out as bleaker or just plain tragic that I've had in my head for weeks now. This is the first of my picks. Have we left our ladies for the lyrics of a song that I'm not singing, tell me I'm not singing? Did we throw it all away for a fantasy? The phantom ship forever sails the sea. Phil likens Chicago to the Scorpion and the Scorpion to the Flying Dutchman. A cursed ship doomed to sail forever. Legend has it, if you saw it on the water, your own ship was doomed to sink. The World Began in Eden and Ended in Los Angeles is, of course, about LA, where Phil had gotten into the whole war is over thing. If you need to beg or steal or borrow, welcome to Los Angeles, the postcard type punchline. City of Tomorrow. It's another pop-sounding tune and a much-needed break after the devastation in The Scorpion departs. Doesn't Lenny Live Here Anymore is a country rock swing. I think Lenny represents Phil, or at the very least his optimistic spirit vacating the premises as his depression sank in. The charade is through, and you can't seem to run away from you. If this isn't a song about Phil himself, Lenny, at the very least, is singing about himself. Depression sinks in and sucks the life out of creative pursuits. You sit at a desk to lose your life in a letter, but the words don't seem to come, and you know that they're better. The lyrics describe dissociating, mindlessly carrying out routine. The hungry broom makes sure that the room is in order. You pull the shade, all the beds are made, as your lips caress the razor of the blade. Really interesting wording on that razor line. I'll be completely honest, I don't know what to make of it. Lenny's ex shows up to try and lure him out, the haggard ex-lover of a long-time loser, but stands rejectedly as she's turned away. That long-time loser line burns like razor burn. That's what leads me to believe Lenny is singing about himself. You are your own worst critic, and you are your own first bully. While Lenny was a bit difficult to track, Another Age is a pretty straightforward commentary on the never-ending war machine. Phil said Another Age was inspired by meeting a veteran in Hawaii. There's a man walking around the island with a snake cane, picked it up in Thailand from a hurricane, and you know he's not gonna go there. He's been one time too long. America's involvement in Vietnam, Phil says, was part of a long, long pattern that the older generations have seen time and time again. Pray for the aged, it's the dawn of another age, of another age, of another age. Same different war. Phil comes to a different conclusion than he did in I Ain't Marchin' Anymore. We were born in a revolution and died in a wasted war. It's gone that way before. No peace, reason, love, or treason here. I instantly clocked the line, it cannot happen here. This is a very specific reference to the rise in fascism. This was the idea in World War II era America looking at Nazi Germany. Oh, it could never happen here. It can always happen here. Phil's saying no one listened and it's happened here in reference to Nixon's election. The album closes with its title track. For all Death of a Rebel's flaws, Mark Elliott described this track beautifully. Quote, "A tape left behind to be played in the event the body is never recovered." Here, Phil sings Phil Ochs' own eulogy. He's not speaking through any Lenny, any doomed ship crew. This is him, confessing he is irrevocably changed. His once vibrant colors tattered from battle, the triumphant declaration of war is over, replaced by devastating, beautiful piano and a quivering voice. The days grow longer for smaller prizes. Life is weighing heavy on him. His old friends don't recognize him. The heroes have exited stage left, replaced by con men and ladies little more than painted china dolls. The most heartrending lines on the whole album are in this bridge. Had I known the end would end in laughter, still I'd tell my daughter that it doesn't matter. Phil's own revolutionary spirit is crushed, or at the very least, mortally injured. The world laughs in his face. Even after all the atrocities we've heard through this record, Phil still finds it in himself to comfort his little girl. Shielding your child from the real world so she can be an innocent just a little bit longer, it's ultimate selflessness. And I just think the love of a father for his daughter is one of the most beautiful things in the world. In a sick, sad way, the 1968 DNC worked. It was the beginning of the war falling out of favor with the public. Kent State in 1970 flipped a lot of the straight people. John and Yoko, a freaking Beatle, and his artist wife said, "War is over if you want it," and Nixon was eventually exposed as a crook. I know this... Whatever I do, it's not a documentary, it's not an album review, who f***ing knows? This video will get suppressed in the algorithm, but I don't care. Folk's purpose is to hold a mirror to us, to make us viscerally uncomfortable until we buckle down and make real change. Rehearsals for Retirement emphasizes the viscerally uncomfortable part of that mission statement. This is the darkest album I've ever covered on Vinyl Monday, and probably ever will. Over and over again, I've talked about how 1968 in music was the crash back down to earth after rock and roll's psychedelic romp. Rehearsals for Retirement is perhaps the hardest fall. It's such a gory scene, I admittedly flinch. We're listening to an unfixable break. A man's belief that music can change the world, that people are inherently good, crumbles. The 68 DNC was a turning point for America, and Phil knew it. It was a sweeping loss of innocence across the 60s counterculture. We could not go back. The chaos, violence, abuse of state power in the name of keeping the peace. Phil saw that the whole week and put it into this album. In his eyes, it was over. The bad guys won. The kids tried to use yo-yos to take down a tractor, and the tractor won. I wish this album didn't age as well as it has. Again, 1968 absolutely wrote it, but it's a little familiar in 2025. People are lost, disillusioned, suspicious of each other, wondering what the hell comes next. Where do we go from here? What lessons can we carry forward? What did Phil Ochs, the folk singer, die for? It's so cheesy to quote,
"There is nothing to fear but fear itself,"
and I tried to avoid it at all costs, but it's true. The state of the country right now is ruled by fear of the other, whether that's black people, queer people, or people running around in silly red hats. Don't forget the rest of the quote, though. There is nothing to fear but fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. It may have killed his career, but I think Rehearsals for Retirement was the most important creative statement Phil ever made. As he identifies in these songs, the men in office are ruled by fear of the other too. They use chaos and confusion to pull sneaky shit, and they get off on hurting the little guy. If we keep exposing them as the weirdos they are, it will diminish their power. The egos will cannibalize each other and defeat themselves. We're seeing it happen right now, in real time. It's up to us, though, not to repeat the mistakes that got us here in 1968 and in 2025. We can't bury our heads in the sand, hold up silly little signs, and wear performative pink shirts. I can't help but wonder what Phil would have thought of the hypocrisy of the modern Democratic Party. We can't sit around on our hands for the next few years like our congressmen are now. That's part of how we got here. We have to put in the work, even if the gratification is not instant, even if we don't get to see the flowers from the seeds we sowed. I think Zoomers still have that lesson to learn. That's why our activism sucks. That, and we can't talk to people. Phil loved talking to people. It's how he was able to make the music he did. This might be my bleary-eyed hippie optimism talking, but no matter how dire things look, the pendulum always swings back. There are still important lessons to be learned from the folk tradition. Phil Ochs, the folk singer, did not die in vain. My personal favorites off this one are Pretty Smart on My Part, The Dollhouse, William Butler Yeats / Where Were You in Chicago, The Scorpion Departs, and Rehearsals for Retirement. Remember, if you want to keep up with all of my favorites from all of the Vinyl Mondays, I have a Spotify playlist linked in my description. I update it every week. And that's it! That is Rehearsals for Retirement. What do you think of this album? What do you think of Phil Ochs? Leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing what you guys have to say about albums that I love. And remember, despite what some guy on the internet or what some guy in a tacky gold office says, your opinion matters. If you like what I do here, you should like this video and subscribe to my channel. I post new episodes of Vinyl Monday, Monday mornings at 11, and a new episode of my podcast every other Friday at noon. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week when I'm a 26-year-old. That's right, I picked this as my last episode as a 25-year-old. We can unpack that in the comments as well. Bye!